Good morning, Magic! I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and I want to answer a popular question from last week. Why doesn't Consider from Midnight Hunt say Surveil 1? Let's dig in. In Guilds of Ravnica, we introduced a new mechanic, Surveil. This was the blue-black Demir's mechanic for the set, and showed up on 19 cards. To Surveil, you look at some cards from the top of your library and put any number you want into your graveyard. Essentially, it's exactly the same as Scry, but the cards go into the graveyard instead of the bottom of your library. These graveyard shenanigans were relevant for cards in the set that cared about your graveyard, and especially with Golgari and their Undergrowth mechanic, it made a lot of sense. Outside of that, the main place where Surveil mattered were cards that cared about you surveilling, like Dimir Spybug and Disinformation Campaign. But like mini mechanics, it showed up in that one set and then wasn't seen again. Well, outside of a cameo on a few cards in Modern Horizons 2 anyway. But that set was targeted at very experienced players and had 59 non-evergreen mechanics. So Surveil was really just at the party along with everybody else. So why isn't Surveil here in Innistrad on Consider? Well, first and foremost, Surveil isn't evergreen. There's a small list of evergreen mechanics like flying and first strike that can be used anywhere, any set, and any time. Whereas the vast majority of mechanics appear in the set they were released in, and then, if they're popular, may be reused in some set down the line. We do a lot of this to remove complexity. We use keywords as a tool to help batch an idea of something in your head. For example, you learn what flying is, and you're going to see a lot of flying cards. So eventually, you can just shortcut all those words to flying. But this also has a cost: learning the vocabulary and jargon. Teaching you a term for a keyword that you might never see again doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, it's more words to write out the keyword and then a parenthetical about the keyword than just writing out all the text without a keyword in the first place. If we very rarely use Surveil, and there are only a couple cards in Midnight Hunt with Surveil, then someone learning what Surveil is just one more thing to learn in a wave of jargon. And when you're learning Magic, which is already a very complicated game, this can make a big difference. This isn't the first time we've done something like this at all. For example, Gearseeker Serpent doesn't have affinity for artifacts, and Bolthound doesn't have Battle Cry. Teaching you those words here is extra jargon. And if every mechanic we ever did showed up as a singleton in a set where we did something that happened to be similar, well, then every set starts becoming shades of Modern Horizons 2, which is a very tough set to understand. Second, there's something unusual you might not notice about Guilds of Ravnica. Something's missing. There are no cards with Scry in the entire set. That's because doing Scry and Surveil in the same set is just confusing. It's so easy to get them mixed up. Which card does what again? How does this operation work? Well, Modern Horizons 2 gets a pass on this because it's a much more complex set for a different audience. The same is not true here. The design team was using Scry, as you've already seen on cards like Play with Fire in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So that's another reason why we wouldn't use Surveil. And finally, just on the topic of using Surveil more in general, many players react negatively to having to put cards into their graveyard. Granted, in Innistrad, it makes more sense. But the feel bad of dropping your awesome bomb spell into your graveyard instead of putting it on the bottom of your library where you could theoretically shuffle it back into your deck is meaningful. And that is amplified further when what the player needs to do is get rid of their card so they can find their land, but instead they choose to keep it and have a worse game because they don't want it out of their deck forever. If you're an experienced player, I know that you know putting cards into your graveyard is typically an advantage. But for many players, that's not at all how it feels. It's just a slight knock against evergreening Surveil and doing it more often instead of Scry. Now, I do want to acknowledge there's synergy with Surveil that specifically calls the mechanic out. We made cards in Guilds of Ravnica that cared about it. If you like Surveil, you would probably like more tools to play with it. And there may very well be some of those eventually. And a set totally could use Surveil as a set mechanic if it wanted. But making a mechanic for a set, giving cards that call it out, and then the mechanic not being evergreen in other sets is nothing new. Cards care about Explore and that's not in more sets. And there are cards that care about kicker, and that's not in most sets. In this case, the team chose to stick with Scry and not use Surveil. Now, I enjoy Surveil and think it will return someday in a set. But until then, you'll just have to consider using the Surveil cards that already exist. Would you like to see Surveil return? If so, let me know in the comments down below. I'll talk with you again on Wednesday. But in the meantime, may you find what you need on top of your library. You got this.